A single bell rang once inside the deep space monitoring station at the edge of the Sol system, a soft sound nobody usually noticed. The alert did not flash red. It flickered a pale, neutral blue, registering a gravitational variance that should have taken 3 solar weeks to arrive. Dr. Hadia Roth did not drop her stylus. She did not jump from her seat. She simply paused, her finger resting against the worn wooden frame of her desk, and watched the line steady itself on the screen. The instrument showed 12 massive, gold-plated objects settling into a perfect geostationary lock just beyond the outer ice belt. They were foreign, dense, and vast. The largest object, a vessel designated by the system as the flagship of an unknown fleet, carried a hull signature that had no match in the local registry. The machine calculated its mass at millions of tons, yet it had cleared the jump corridor without leaving a single heat plume or a wake of displaced ion particles. 12 ships at the Sol edge, Hadia said into the open log. She adjusted the heavy, fringed gray woolen shawl around her shoulders, her movements deliberate and slow. Run the protocol. Soft posture, eyes open. The system showed no weapon tracking signatures from the visitors. There was no shield flare, no active scanning beam, and no declaration of intent across the standard frequencies. The incoming vessels simply existed in the dark, heavy and silent, like ancient stone markers left in a field. Hadia reached down, her thumb catching on a rough thread of her shawl, and felt the chill of the station's floorboards through her thin boots. The screen updated, drawing the clean, sweeping lines of the lead ship. According to the Automated Historical Archive, the design belonged to an entity called the Tavari Imperium, a civilization that had mapped the inner core of the galaxy, while the ancestors of Earth were still learning to shape flint. The flagship bore a name translated through the old trade codes, the Sundered Crown. It was a vessel built for obedience, its gold-veined structural robes reflecting the dim light of the distant sun. "No hostile signal," Hadia whispered, her eyes tracking the steady pulse of the monitoring line. "The ships are holding position. Earth is making tea." Would you have stayed, or would you have run because she didn't run? 10 minutes after the arrival, the air inside the station grew thin. Hadia noticed the oxygen scrubbers had dropped their output by exactly 4%, a minor efficiency shift that occurred only when the external magnetic field grew dense enough to alter the station's outer shell. She stood up, her knee joint popping in the quiet room, and walked over to the manual console. The data feed from the outer sensors was completely clean. There were no radio messages, no digital handshakes, and no broad-spectrum greetings. Instead, a local tracking drone, a small, civilian-grade survey unit no larger than a teacup, sent back a raw video feed from its position near the ice belt. On the screen, the tiny human drone appeared as a speck of gray paint against the towering golden wall of the Sundered Crown. The Imperial flagship was a mountain of worked alloy, its flanks carved with geometric symbols that signified 40,000 years of unbroken rule. It looked down upon the small blue world 3 sectors away with the heavy, unblinking patience of a predator that had never encountered a fence. The drone drifted within 2 miles of the flagship's main drive array. Suddenly, the video feed did not cut out or blur with static. It expanded. The drone's basic optical scanner, designed only to measure the iron content of passing rocks, began to receive a massive, unencrypted stream of technical data directly from the alien hull. Hadia sat back down, the gray shawl slipping from her left shoulder. The data was not a warning or a list of demands. It was a complete, structural blueprint of the Imperial flagship itself. Every deck, every reactor core, every shield generator, and every structural seam was laid out in plain, human-readable vectors. Deep within the structural map of Deck 9, a small red indicator began to pulse. The human drone had located a microfracture, a microscopic tear in the primary support lattice that had been hidden behind 3 layers of heavy armor plate for 600 years. The drone's automated programming did not launch a missile or flag the spot for a targeting computer. It simply calculated the exact thermal welding parameters needed to fix the tier, bundled the solution into a standard maintenance packet, and beamed it back to the alien flagship as a courtesy. High Observer Ranvish stood on the command bridge of the sundered crown, his twin sensory crests flattening flat against his brow. His towering frame, draped in the gold-veined structural robes of his office, remained rigid, but his long, three-jointed fingers gripped his heavy ceremonial staff until the metal clicked. "The primitive device has altered our internal registry," the bridge officer said, his voice dropping into a register reserved for structural failures. "It did not penetrate our scanning fields. It simply ignored them." Ranvish did not look at the officer. He watched the main tactical display, where the tiny human survey drone was now drifting away toward a piece of space debris, its task completed. The repair specifications for Deck 9 were still flashing on his primary terminal, written in clean, mathematical notation that used the Imperium's own ancient engineering symbols. "Did they demand submission?" Ranvish asked. His voice was low, tuned exclusively to the command frequency of his staff. "No, High Observer," the officer replied. "They sent an invitation to the halfway station. They have prepared common quarters. They asked if we require additional fuel for our auxiliary systems." Ranvish turned his head toward the viewport. Below them, the world called Earth sat behind its thin blue veil. According to the Imperial logs, this sector was supposed to contain a young, fragile species that had barely transitioned from chemical propulsion to basic gravity manipulation. The records indicated they were loud, divided, and easily broken by the weight of a professional fleet. Yet there were no defense platforms orbiting the planet. There were no battle stations, no missile silos, and no weapon arrays pointed at the stars. The world was surrounded only by a single, perfectly rigid orbital ring that stayed in place against the planet's tidal shear forces without using any visible tethers or propulsion jets. It was an engineering feat that the Imperium's Central Academy had declared mathematically impossible 3,000 years ago. "The sensors are fine," Ranvish muttered, his hand tightening again on his staff. "The target world has an integrated orbital ring, lunar industry, and silent transit lanes. Our historical data is not old. It is wrong." The journey to the halfway station took 3 hours. The Imperium's shuttle moved with heavy ceremonial pomp, its sublight engines leaving a bright, brilliant trail of plasma across the dark. Beside Ranvish sat Counselor Giovanni, a hardline traditionalist whose gold-veined robes were so stiff they did not wrinkle when he leaned forward. "It is a trick of the local light," Giovanni said, his voice flat with certainty. "They have found an old machine left by the precursors. They are children wearing their parents' armor." Ranvish did not answer. He was watching the human vessel that had been sent to escort them. The ship was named Merper, a small, unarmored transport that looked like a smooth white pebble taken from a river. It had no visible engine cowlings, no thruster ports, and no weapon mounts. It glided beside the Imperial shuttle at a matching speed, its hull completely cold to the shuttle's heat-seeking scanners. When the two vessels matched velocity, Commander Adaru, the shuttle's pilot, fired a high-frequency analytical pulse toward the human ship. It was a standard tactical move, a passive scan designed to read the internal layout of a target before docking. The pulse did not return. It did not bounce off a shield or get absorbed by armor. On the shuttle's tactical screen, the human vessel simply ceased to reflect energy at all. The return signal died the moment it touched the white hull, leaving a black, empty hole in the shuttle's display where the ship should have been. "The handshake is blocked," Adaru whispered, his fingers dancing across his console. "There is no return data path. They are not hiding their signature. They are choosing not to have one." "Increase the pulse power," Giovanni ordered, his sensory crests rising in anger. "Force the reflection." Before Adaru could touch the controls, the human vessel turned slightly. A small communication line opened on the shuttle's main receiver. It was not a military broadcast or a declaration of territory. It was a voice, calm and clear, speaking in the old high dialect of Tavar Prime. "Your scanning parameters are running hot, Commander," the human operator said. "Your internal bridge temperatures have increased by 3 degrees due to the power draw. We have adjusted our hull density so your instruments do not overheat. Please use the secondary dock. The air is ready." Ranvish looked down at his own console. The internal temperature reading on his bridge had indeed risen, an operational detail his own instruments had not yet flagged. He leaned back into his heavy seat, his ceremonial staff resting against his knee. Panic is a luxury reserved for those who still have time to spare. The airlock of the halfway station opened with a soft, dry hiss that smelled of alpine cedar and mountain rain. Speaker Lione, the senior diplomatic representative of the Imperium, stepped onto the docking platform with her 3 bodyguards, their long kinetic rifles held across their chests. She had spent 2 decades forcing compliance on the border worlds, and she knew the value of a heavy footstep. The reception room was small, square, and built from plain, unpolished gray stone. There were no banners, no trophies of war, and no ranks of armed guards. At the center of the room stood a long wooden table with 2 chairs. Dr. Hadia Roth sat in one of them, still wrapped in her gray woolen shawl, her fingers turning a small, pale ceramic teacup. As Lione approached, she felt a sudden, strange shift in her chest. The heavy, constant vibration of her personal scanning shield, a defense field that usually hummed against her ribs like a trapped bee, had gone completely silent. The lights on her wrist unit were dead. "Your defensive field has been grounded," Hadia said, not looking up from her cup. "The stone in this room is non-reactive. It bleeds off static energy. It is safer for the breathing lines." Lione stopped, her hand dropping toward her side. "We did not grant permission for structural suppression." "It is not suppression," Hadia replied softly, finally looking up. Her eyes were tired, surrounded by the small lines of someone who spent her life looking at low-contrast displays. "It is just common architecture. Sit down, Speaker. The water is hot." On the wall behind Hadia, a small, white plastic box, a standard civilian comfort module used in Terran field kits, flickered once. It was a tiny device, no larger than a brick, designed to regulate the humidity and atmospheric mix of a temporary shelter. Lione stepped closer to the table, her eyes fixed on the white box. Her personal biomonitors, which had been dead since she crossed the threshold, suddenly came back to life, but they were no longer reading her own vital signs. They were reading the environment. The air inside the stone room had adjusted itself to the exact atmospheric pressure, oxygen ratio, and moisture content of Lione's home village on Tavar Prime, a world 4,000 light-years away. "How long have you monitored our home world to achieve this baseline?" Lione demanded, her voice tightening. "We haven't," Hadia said. She reached for a pale ceramic steaming vessel at the center of the table and poured a stream of clear water into a second cup. "The module read your clothing fibers when you walked through the door. It took about 3 seconds. It's an old model. The new ones don't need the physical contact." Lione did not sit. She looked at the cup being offered to her. The liquid inside was clear, smelling faintly of dried leaves and cold earth. "A strong, cruel civilization is simple to oppose," Lione said, her voice dropping into the formal rhythm of the imperial courts. "A strong, kind civilization completely unravels your history. What do you want from our fleet, Dr. Roth?" Hadia set the steaming vessel down with a small, hollow click against the wood. "We wanted to know if you liked the tea." Speaker Lione did not answer. She remained standing by the heavy wooden table, her long, metallic robes casting a rigid reflection against the gray stone. Behind her, the 3 imperial bodyguards shifted their weight, their boots scratching against the non-reactive floorboards. They were trained to respond to threats, to structural barriers, and to the heavy clank of charging armor. They had no tactics for a woman offering warm water in a small ceramic cup. "We are here to discuss territory," Lione said, her voice flattening as she forced herself to sit. The wooden chair did not creak under her weight, a small detail that made her look down. It had been reinforced with a dense, hidden fiber that absorbed the mass of her towering frame instantly. The Tavari Imperium does not adjust its diplomatic baseline for refreshments. "Of course," Dr. Hadia Roth replied. She set her own cup down, her fingers retreating into the folds of her fringed gray shawl. "Let us talk about the outer ice belt. Your ships are drawing energy from the subsurface iron deposits on the fourth moon. Our automated maintenance units are already working around your landing struts to keep the crust from fracturing." Lione's left sensory crest twitched. She tapped her wrist console twice, but the interface remained dark, its power drained by the bleeding effect of the stone walls. "Our flagships do not cause crustal fractures. They are anchored by gravitational dampeners that have held steady across 40,000 years of Imperial history." "They were steady," Hadia said softly, "until your engineers increased the core resonance to penetrate our white hulls. Now the moon is ringing like a bell. If you leave the dampeners at this frequency, the landing site will collapse into the mantle within 12 hours. Before Lione could dismiss the warning, the heavy door at the back of the room slid open without a sound. A young Terran field engineer named Priya walked in, her boots covered in gray, frozen dust from the outer docks. She carried a small, fist-sized metal cylinder that hummed with a low, flat vibration. "The lattice repair device is cold, Dr. Roth," Priya said, ignoring the Imperial bodyguards completely. She set the cylinder on the edge of the wooden table. The third flagship's engine housing had a secondary tier along the main fuel manifold. I went ahead and stabilized it while the automated drones were clearing the landing field. Counselor Giovanni, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped into the room, his long ceremonial staff striking the stone with a dull clink. "You touched the engine array of an Imperial dreadnought without an authorization code. That lattice is forged from cold-pressed stellar iron. It cannot be altered by a civilian hand tool." Priya turned, her face pale from the long shift in the thin air. She looked at Giovanni's gold-veined robes, then down at the small cylinder on the table. "The iron wasn't cold-pressed, sir. It was layered using an old magnetic press that left structural bubbles every 3 meters. If I hadn't read the molecular memory and reset the alignment, your fuel manifold would have turned to powder the next time you initiated a jump." She touched the top of the cylinder. A small, clear projection floated above the wood, showing the internal matrix of the Imperial flagship's engine. The warped atomic lines were turning blue, locking into a flawless, rigid pattern that looked more like grown crystal than poured metal. It had taken exactly 11 seconds for the device to rewrite the architecture of the Imperium's most expensive warship. "This is an act of industrial espionage," Giovanni shouted, his sensory crests rising to their full height. "You have mapped our defense secrets." "We didn't map them," Priya said, her voice dropping into a tired, casual whisper. "Your ship's computer was broadcasting its error log on an open civilian frequency, because the internal clock is running 40 years behind the local solar variants. We just fixed the leak so our monitoring station could stop hearing the noise." Ranvish, who had remained silent by the window, walked toward the table. His long, 3-jointed fingers did not touch his staff. He looked at the projection of his ship's engine, his eyes tracking the perfect alignment of the blue crystals. He had spent his youth studying the capital forges of Tavar Prime, where master engineers spent generations using massive orbital hammers to shape those identical manifolds. "The device," Ranvish said, his vocal register dropping into the quiet tone of a scholar. "It does not use heat. It does not use kinetic force. How does it convince the iron to change its shape?" It doesn't convince it, Hadia said, taking a slow sip from her ceramic cup. It just reminds the iron where it belongs. Every lattice remembers its original state before the forge distorted it. The tool just clears the friction. A civilian tool, Ranvish repeated, his three-jointed fingers curling into his palm. A standard maintenance kit, Hadia corrected. Our deep space scouts carry them to fix the water pipes when the ice storms hit the outposts. We didn't design them for warships. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the low, regular hum of the white comfort module on the wall. Liony sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her gold-veined knees. She was looking at the small human drone that had followed Priya into the room, a teacup-sized piece of plastic and wire that was currently hovering near the ceiling, its optical lens blinking with a dull green light. The drone was not scanning them. It was not recording their words for a military archive. It was simply measuring the moisture content of the room to ensure the alpine cedar scent did not dry out Liony's breathing passages. The Empire's grand strategy, its 40,000 years of conquests, and its unmatched golden fleet had been reduced to an operational variable in a human ventilation system. "Your world," Liony said, her voice dropping the formal cadence of the courts. "The orbital ring we saw when we arrived. The text matrix books at the Central Academy say an object of that mass cannot remain rigid without structural cables tied to the planet's core. Yet our scanners found nothing. No lines, no anchor points, no propulsion fields." Hadia set her cup down, her thumb tracing the rough, unadorned lip of the ceramic. "The Academy was looking for tension, Speaker. They thought you had to pull an object to keep it from falling." "And you do not," Giovanni demanded. "We don't pull," Hadia said. "We don't push, either. The ring stays there because we told the space inside the circle to stop moving. The planet turns beneath it, but the ring is anchored to the geometry of the system itself. It doesn't need tethers because it has nowhere else to go." Giovanni's staff slipped slightly against the stone, making a sharp, scratching sound that felt too loud in the small room. "You have locked the coordinates of the vacuum. That requires more energy than a star produces in its lifetime." "Only if you fight the current," Priya said, leaning against the edge of the table. "If you map the local shear forces and let the solar wind do the lifting, the ring doesn't cost anything to maintain. It's like a leaf sitting on top of a whirlpool. It doesn't need an engine to stay above the water." Ranvish stepped closer, his gold-veined robes brushing against the wooden table. He looked down at Hadia, his twin sensory crests flattening in a gesture that signified deep internal calculation. "Your records," Ranvish whispered. "The trade codes we used to translate your greetings. They were written 3 centuries ago by our deep space monitors. They reported a world of factories, of coal smoke, of iron tracks laid across the dirt. They said you were small." "We were," Hadia said. She looked out the small window, where the sun was just beginning to touch the outer edge of the Sol system's ice belt. "The universe was brutal to our ancestors, so we chose to be fiercely gentle with one another instead. When the great frost hit our inner cities, we realized we couldn't afford to spend our iron on weapons. We needed every ounce of it just to keep the children warm." "So you abandoned the sword," Liony said. "We grew up," Hadia replied. "A strong, cruel civilization is simple to oppose, Speaker. You just build a thicker wall or a longer spear. But a civilization that doesn't want your land, doesn't need your oil, and simply offers to fix your broken engines, that is something your history books don't know how to fight." She stood up, her gray woolen shawl trailing behind her like a quiet shadow. She walked toward the manual console at the side of the room and pressed a single blue key. The main tactical screen changed. The structural map of the Imperial flagship faded, replaced by a wide-angle view of the outer Sol system. The 12 golden dreadnoughts were still holding their geostationary lock, their massive frames glowing under the light of the distant stars. But they were no longer alone. Beyond the Golden Fleet, Out in the deep black where the solar wind began to thin, 300 white pebbles had materialized without a sound. They had no engine plumes. They had no energy signatures. They were perfectly silent, perfectly cold, and perfectly aligned, forming a massive, unbroken circle that completely enclosed the Imperial warships from every side. "Your flagships are beautiful, High Observer," Hadia said, her voice remaining low and steady. "But your physics simply stopped moving forward 40 centuries ago. Our transport vessels have been sitting in your blind spots since the moment you cleared the jump corridor. We weren't waiting for a battle." Ranvish watched the screen, his long fingers tightening on his staff until the ancient gold vein cracked under the pressure. "What were you waiting for?" Hadia turned back to the table, her face illuminated by the pale blue light of the console. "We were waiting for the water to boil." High Observer Ranvish looked from the screen to the small ceramic teacup sitting on the dark wood. The water inside was completely still, but a single column of white steam was now rising toward the comfort module on the ceiling, twisting slowly in the artificial alpine air. At that exact second, every light on the bridge of the Imperial flagship, 3 miles away in the frozen dark, went completely black. The darkness did not drop like a shutter. It arrived as a heavy, liquid weight, expanding from the center of High Observer Ranvish's console until every indicator light on his ceremonial staff died at the same millisecond. In the receive room of the station, the quiet did not shatter. It grew thick. Counselor Giovanni made a small, strangled sound in his throat, his long fingers clawing at the gold-veined structural fabric of his collar, as if the atmosphere itself had been disconnected. He lunged toward the gray stone wall, his boots sliding on the non-reactive floorboards, and slammed the heavy metal butt of his staff against the masonry. "The signal," Giovanni hissed, his sensory crests flattened so tightly against his skull they looked like scars. "The flagship has dropped from the tactical mesh. They have launched an atmospheric strike against our primary matrices." "Nobody launched a strike, Counselor," Dr. Hadia Roth said. She did not rise from her wooden chair. She simply pulled the edge of her gray woolen shawl tighter across her chest, her movements small and cold in the blue-tinted dimness of the room. "Your engineers tried to draw power from our orbital ring stabilizer grid to force a security handshake. Our system doesn't fight an intrusion. It handles it like an overcharged wire." "A blackout," Speaker Lyony whispered. Her voice had lost its formal cadence, dropping into the dry, clicking register of the lower border settlements. "You have unanchored a 40,000-ton vessel in a geostationary lane." "The flagship isn't falling," Priya said, leaning back against the edge of the table with her arms crossed. She pointed a clean, oil-stained finger toward the main screen, where the pale blue vectors were already redrawing themselves using the civilian drone's battery backup line. "The ring took your primary core offline to save your manifold from melting. If we hadn't grounded your circuit, your crew would have been a cloud of iron dust before you could have turned your key." Ranvish stepped away from the window, his gold-veined robe sweeping over the frozen dust Priya had brought in from the docks. He did not look at Giovanni or the bodyguards who were still holding their dead kinetic rifles against their chests. He watched the small ceramic teacup on the table. The water inside had stopped steaming, its surface perfectly flat, reflecting the neutral blue light of the backup monitor like a tiny, frozen mirror. "The 300 white vessels," Ranvish said, his vocal cords vibrating at a frequency that did not register on the room's standard audio logs. "They are not carrying heavy missiles. They are not carrying shield breakers. My scanning arrays are dead, but my blood knows the weight of an engine. Those are transport ships." "They are," Hadia agreed, her face staying in the shadow of her shawl. "They are standard grain carriers and planetary transit hulls. We use them to move soil and seed across the inner colony loops. They don't have armor plates because there is nothing out here that wants to hurt them." "Then why are they holding the perimeter?" Giovanni demanded, his voice rising until it cracked against the low stone ceiling. Why have they circled our grand fleet if they do not intend to burn us? They are waiting to help your crew down, Hadia said softly. Your flagship's secondary life support will drop its heat retention within 3 hours. The 300 ships are simply there to ensure your people have a warm place to sit while our maintenance drones re-weld your main power bus. It is a standard recovery configuration. Lione stood up, her long robes catching on the corner of the wooden table with a sharp, tearing sound that no one noticed. She walked to the center of the room, her 3-jointed fingers reaching out toward the white comfort module on the wall. The device was still humming, its tiny green light blinking with the steady, unbothered rhythm of a kitchen clock. You do not understand our history, Dr. Roth, Lione said, her sensory crests rising slightly as she faced the older woman. The Tavari Imperium has never accepted an extraction from a primitive infrastructure. If our crews see your grain carriers approaching their airlocks while their screens are black, they will detonate their own reactor cores before they allow their banners to touch your deck. They won't detonate anything, Priya said, tapping the side of the metal cylinder on the table. The moment your core went dark, our system initiated a local safety freeze. Your reactor valves are locked into a maintenance loop that can only be turned with a manual wrench from the outside. We didn't want anyone hurting themselves because they misread the instructions. Giovanni's hand shook against his staff. The gold-veined metal clicked against his rings, a small, hollow sound that seemed to mark the exact second the Empire's pride began to turn into something else. This is a trap, a systematic humiliation disguised as an accident. You knew our sensors would react to the white hulls. We didn't know anything about your sensors, Hadia said, her voice remaining plain and clear. She reached down into her gray shawl, her hand coming out with a small, printed piece of paper, the working copy of the system log she had been reading before the bell rang. She did not hand it to Giovanni. She simply laid it on the dark wood of the table, the small letters facing up. We just knew your core was old. When an architecture stays the same for 40 centuries, it doesn't get stronger, counselor. It just forgets how to look for the things that don't make a noise. Ranvish walked back to the window, his long frame casting a narrow shadow across the floorboards. Out in the black, the 12 golden dreadnoughts looked smaller now, their brilliant hulls turning a dark, dead bronze under the light of the distant stars. The circle of white pebbles remained perfectly rigid around them, an unbroken line of silent stones that did not move, did not signal, and did not care about the gold veins on the imperial robes. High Observer, Giovanni whispered, stepping close to his superior's shoulder. We still have the ceremonial staff. The short-range emergency frequency is built into the base. If I press the third notch, the secondary escort ships will launch their kinetic darts toward the planetary ring. We can break the circle before their grid stabilizes. Ranvish did not move his head. He looked down at his own long, 3-jointed fingers, tracking the faint pulse of his blood beneath his gray skin. He thought of the grand halls of Tavar Prime, where the stone columns were carved with the numbers of every world the Imperium had ever registered, catalogued, and brought into the long, linear line of their progress. The digital clock on our flagship is running 40 years slow, Giovanni, Ranvish said, his voice dropping into a register that made the bodyguards look at the floor. The human drone did not break our security codes. It simply read our history because we were broadcasting it like an old song. If you launch the darts, they will not hit the ring. They will simply stop moving because the space inside that circle has been told to remain still. We must maintain the posture, Giovanni said, his sensory crests trembling. If the council floor hears that we surrendered a grand fleet to a collection of grain carriers without a single weapon being drawn, the assembly will collapse before the winter consolidation. The assembly is already gone, Speaker Lione said from the table. She had not touched the ceramic cup, but her hand was resting near its base, feeling the last of the heat bleeding into the wood. They are not asking for our submission, Giovanni. They are asking if we require additional fuel. That is not an ultimatum. That is a funeral service for our superiority. Hadia Roth turned her chair slightly, her boots making a soft, creaking sound against the floor. She looked at the three Imperial representatives, her eyes steady behind her thin spectacles. "There will be no submission, Speaker," Hadia said. "We don't have a hall to put your banners in. We don't have a ledger for your names. The planet will keep turning, the ring will stay rigid, and your ships will go back to the core when their lines are clean. But you will have to tell your council that the sky is much bigger than your books." At that exact second, a new sound came through the room's open audio log. Not a bell, and not an alarm, but a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to rise from the deep structure of the halfway station itself. It was the sound of a large, heavy machine resetting its internal magnets, a long, deep sigh of metal that carried a strange, hollow echo from the lower decks. Priya did not look up from her console, but her fingers stopped moving across the blue interface. "Dr. Roth," she said, her voice dropping all its casual warmth. "The automated survey drone just finished its secondary scan of the flagship's lower hold." "Is the manifold holding?" Hadia asked. "The manifold is fine," Priya said, her eyes fixed on a single line of red text that had appeared at the bottom of her screen. "But the drone didn't find fuel crates in the main cargo bay, Dr. Roth. It found something else, and it's currently broadcasting an ancient human encryption key that hasn't been active since the Great Frost." Ranvish turned from the window, his ceremonial staff slipping from his three-jointed fingers and hitting the floorboards with a heavy, metallic crash that made every bodyguard drop his weapon. The heavy metal stick slid across the floorboards, its gold-veined surface casting a cold, dull reflection before stopping against Dr. Hadia Roth's boot. No one moved to pick it up. The three Imperial bodyguards remained still, their fingers frozen against the grips of their dead rifles, their eyes fixed on the low wooden table where the blue console line continued to pulse. "The signal is coming from the lower storage cells," Priya said, her voice dropping all its previous lightness. She touched the panel, and the unencrypted data feed split into two parallel text columns. "It isn't a modern Imperial code, Dr. Roth. It's an old digital beacon from the early expansion era. It's a tracking registry for a colony ship called the Gideon." High Observer Ranvish did not reach for his fallen staff. His twin sensory crests remained completely flat against his gray brow, his long frame leaning slightly toward the wooden table. He looked at the printed paper Hadia had laid down, his three-jointed fingers tightening until his joints went pale. "The Gideon was recorded as space debris in our central charts," Ranvish said, his vocal cords vibrating at a raw, uncalibrated frequency. "Our ancestors found the hull drifting beyond the inner core 40 centuries ago. It was an empty shell of iron and dead wiring. There were no biological remains." "The shell was empty because the people weren't in the hull," Hadia said. She reached down, her fingers grazing the fringe of her gray woolen shawl, and drew her ancient paper ledger toward the center of the table. "They were in your capital forges, High Observer. Your history books call them the first workers. Our records call them the families of the fourth sector." Speaker Lyony stepped closer to the table, her long, metallic robes making a sharp, scratching sound against the non-reactive floorboards. She looked at the red text pulsing at the bottom of the display. "The first workers were not a foreign species. They were the foundation of our engineering guilds. They built the capital hammers that shaped our flagship manifolds." "They built them because they had the molecular memory," Priya said, pointing to the crystalline lines on the repair projection. "Your ancestors didn't invent cold-pressed stellar iron. You found a human construction crew that had been frozen in the deep dark since the Great Frost, and you gave them a choice between the hammers or the vacuum." Counselor Giovanni's face turned the color of dry salt. He reached into the folds of his gold-veined collar, his hand shaking as he pulled out a small, ceremonial key that he did not use. "The guilds are sacred. Their lineages are recorded in the Central Academy archives. There is no mention of a primitive origin. The archives recorded the names of the masters. Giovanni, Hadia said softly, her eyes steady behind her thin spectacles. They didn't record the people who held the wrenches in the dark, but the iron remembered. She stood up, her movements deliberate and slow, and walked over to the manual console at the side of the room. She pressed a single blue key, and the main tactical screen changed once more. The wide-angle view of the Sol system faded, replaced by a live optical feed from the interior of the Imperial flagship's main cargo hold. On the screen, behind the rows of polished fuel crates and golden armor plates, stood a massive, unadorned iron bulkhead. It was covered in 3 layers of Imperial seal paint, but the automated human survey drone had already scraped away the gold leaf, revealing a line of simple, block-style letters stamped directly into the metal. Sol Ironworks, Hull Section 4. Your Grand Fleet didn't come here to conquer a new world, Hadia said, her voice remaining plain and clear in the quiet room. You came home because your old architecture was running out of memory. The flagship's computer was broadcasting that error log because it was trying to find the original tracking beacon to reset its internal clock. It was looking for Earth all along. Ranvish looked from the iron bulkhead on the screen to the small ceramic teacup sitting on the dark wood. The water inside had gone completely cold, its surface perfectly still, reflecting nothing but the pale blue light of the backup monitor. We built our empire on a stolen wrench, Ranvish whispered, his sensory crests trembling as he looked at Hadia. Everyone starts small, high observer, Hadia said. She reached down and picked up the heavy golden staff from the floor, holding it out to him by the iron base rather than the decorated tip. We didn't circle your fleet to take revenge for the Gideon. We circled them because your flagship's core is venting radiation into Deck 9, and our transport ships have the only filters that can stop the leak. Leonie sat back down, her hands resting flat on her knees. She looked at the 300 white pebbles on the tactical screen, their unbroken circle holding steady against the solar wind. There will be no banners, Leonie said, her voice dropping into a clear, quiet whisper. No weapons, no surrender. Just the maintenance, Hadia replied. The work took 3 hours. The Imperial crew did not detonate their reactors. They opened their airlocks to let the small, teacup-sized civilian drones inside. In the lower hold, under the direction of Priya's hand tools, the ancient iron bulkhead was cleared of its gold paint, its original serial numbers left visible against the stellar alloy. High Observer Ranvish stood by the station window, watching the white transport vessels slide back into their regular colony loops. The 12 golden dreadnoughts were firing their main drives again, their indicator lights returning to a soft, calibrated blue that matched the monitoring lines on Hadia's screen. We will return to Tavar Prime, Ranvish said, his ceremonial staff resting lightly against his 3-jointed fingers. The Central Academy will have to rewrite the first 3 chapters of the text matrix books. Tell them to use plain words, Hadia said, her fingers retreating once more into her gray woolen shawl. It makes the pages easier to read when the light gets thin. She turned away from the console and walked toward the back door of the room. She did not look back at the gold-veined robes or the high Imperial representatives. Her boots made a soft, regular creaking sound against the non-reactive floorboards until the door slid closed behind her. Outside the halfway station, the dark patch of space where the fleet had rested was completely clear. The sun was just beginning to touch the outer edge of the Sol system's ice belt, casting a long, pale pink light across the solar transit lanes. Dr. Hadia Roth walked into the quiet kitchen of her living quarters and set her paper ledger on the shelf. She reached for the pale ceramic steaming vessel sitting by the small stove, her hand catching on the rough fringed edge of her gray shawl. She did not fill a new cup. She simply turned the valve on the water line, her fingers steady as the metal began to warm beneath her thumb. The kettle was already on for the next guest.